Hey y'all, are you wondering how to start a nonprofit and you don't have any staff and how that works and how you get staff? I'm going to break that down in this video today. Let's get into it. Hey y'all, this is Tiffany with Boss on a Budget. I help new and small nonprofits get up and running. If you need help starting your nonprofit and also raising money for your nonprofit, make sure you subscribe because I drop videos every week, y'all. So I wanted to talk about how do you manage as a new nonprofit and you don't have staff? How do you start? What do you do? How do you make it work so that you can eventually have staff, right? So I want to talk through all the nuances of this because this is not a simple explanation. It's kind of complicated. So you should get your notes out. You should listen carefully because there's just a lot of layers to this that I'm going to try to break down. So I'm going to try to break this down into three big chunks. So the first big chunk is talking about the difference between board and staff. The second chunk is talking about the chief executive officer of the organization. And the third chunk is the concept of the working board. And then just at the end, I'm just going to share some tips for how do you transition to a staff position, right? How do you transition so that you can start paying staff? So let's talk about the difference between board members and staff because there are differences, right? So usually board operates on one level, staff operate on a different level. Board members provide oversight, direction, the strategic vision. They help with the financing and fundraising for the overall organization. They basically are there to make sure that the organization has everything it needs strategically, financially, legally, and able to thrive in order to thrive, right? Staff, on the other hand, help to execute that vision, right? So the board makes sure that the resources are there in order to do the work. So the staff are put in place to do the actual work and to execute all the things you need to do to reach your outcomes and to be an effective nonprofit. They operate at two different levels. Generally, the board and the staff do not intermingle, right? So generally, the board are off doing their thing. They don't have a lot of interaction with staff members. The liaison between those two is your chief executive officer. So I'm going to explain the chief executive officer, but I want to say first, why am I making this distinction first? I'm doing that because I get a lot of questions from people asking whether or not they can serve on the board and also be paid, right? So I did another video which talks about can board members be paid. I broke a lot of this down as well, so make sure you check out that video too. But generally, board members do not get paid. Generally, most of you watching this video are people who want to do community-based nonprofits. You're not trying to have $1 million budgets. At least at this point, you're trying to be more grassroots and community-led. So generally, if you're doing like direct services like that, your board members are not going to be paid and they do not operate like staff. So you should not be having them on the payroll. That's not how it's supposed to set up. If you need board to function in a staff position, then they need to transition off the board to be a staff member. Now I'm going to talk about how that's different for new nonprofits when I talk about chunk number 3. Okay, so I just want to make sure first, because I'm slow walking this because this is kind of complicated, but I just want to make sure you know at first that the board and the staff are different. They perform different functions and they do not generally intermingle, and it's generally not the norm for board members to be paid. Now, there's a little caveat. Board members sometimes have a certain kind of expertise. Case in point, maybe they're a realtor or maybe they're an accountant. And you all don't have good connections maybe with some of those professionals. And it makes perfect sense to use the person on your board to help you navigate questions around their expertise. And you may encounter a situation where you want to compensate them for their time for providing assistance to the organization. So a lot of people are going to be asking, can I do that? Well, since they can't be staff, can they at least do work for the organization as a separate contract? Generally, that is okay, but as always, if you're a board member, you have to manage conflicts of interest. So that means that you can't be sitting on the board and using it as a way to benefit, right? To benefit you personally or to benefit your business, for example. So you don't want it to be seen that you're just serving on the board for this organization because you're trying to get business from the organization. So when you're choosing a board member to do work for you, you need to make sure that that board member is not part of that conversation, right? And does not vote on whether or not they should be used as that contracted out work. Then you need to make sure that you also look at other options, right? You do your due diligence to make sure that you've looked at other people and you've priced out from other people the cost of the work. And then you want to make sure that whatever you're being charged is reasonable. So you want to do your due diligence to make sure that it's the market rate or that you're not being overcharged for what you're asking the board member to do. Because if they're overcharging you, then it could look like they're doing that so that they can benefit, and they're getting that benefit simply because of their association with the organization, right? So a lot of these things, I'm talking in general terms, but questions around conflicts of interest have to be managed within your board. Your board has to be equipped to have these conversations and to make sure that you're documenting things okay so that the IRS does not have issues with the decisions you're making as an organization. So I told y'all it was going to be a little complicated, but I'm slow walking this because I want to make sure you get all the nuances. Of course, I could say in the beginning, yeah, this is how you do it, or yeah, or no, board can't get paid. But you need to understand the why behind all of this. That's why I'm breaking this down. So let's talk about chunk number 2. Your chief executive officer. So your chief executive officer is the highest ranking staff person in your organization, and typically this is your executive director. Now, organizations use different titles. Sometimes people say, well, what's the difference between CEO and executive director? Y'all, so this is sometimes a decision made by the organization. There is no right answer. There are some definitions of CEO and of executive director, but in different contexts, they mean different things. So you just need to be clear that whatever you're calling that chief staff person, that you're clear that that person is staff and not necessarily a board member. Now, of course, I'm going to make it more complicated by throwing this one at you. As the chief executive officer of the nonprofit organization, you are the main connection between the board and the staff, right? So you are the main contact. You provide the updates to the board on what's happening in the day-to-day operations of the organization, because the board and the staff typically should not be mingling, right? But they can interact for some reasons and for some purposes, but generally they should not be interacting on a daily basis, right? But as the chief executive officer, you have a spot on the board simply because of your position, simply because they need you there on the board to be able to know what's going on. So that's called an ex officio position. I'm going to put it on the screen so you can see the spelling, but also put it in the description box below so you can check out that definition so you understand it for yourself. But it's simply people who serve on the board because of the positions they hold, and because the chief executive officer is the key connection between staff and board, they generally have a spot already on the board. That's just a given. Now, as the chief executive officer, it's the board's responsibility to have oversight over that position. So they have to hire that person. They have to manage that person's compensation. They have to review that person's performance. That is one of their key responsibilities, is to provide oversight of that position. So when people ask me as a founder, well, can I be on the board and be the executive director? Well, you can't be both, because you can't provide oversight of yourself, especially in a nonprofit organization. You have to make sure that you understand the rules and regulations and make sure that it's functioning as an independent organization, right? So if you as a founder want to be the executive director, you should not be serving on the board at the same time. That leads me to chunk number 3, the idea of a working board. So I know you're going to push back on me talking about this. I know there are all kinds of questions that are coming up for you. Namely, well, Tiffany, if we don't have staff and I can't be staff and board, how do we get the work done? I know you're asking me this question right now. So I'm going to introduce the concept of a working board. So if you look at a lot of the resources online, a lot of people don't talk about this a little bit, but because they don't focus on startup nonprofits, a lot of people overlook this concept and don't really get it. But if you're a startup and you don't have a lot of resources and you can't hire, or you're completely volunteer led, then the board has to do staff things. And staff things may be engaging directly with your clients, managing your projects, all that kind of stuff that typically day-to-day staff people would do, the board may have to do. And that's the concept of a working board. You serve as board, you serve as providing oversight, but you also have to do some of the execution. Because if you don't, no one else is there to do it, right? So in the general sense, your nonprofit board and nonprofit staff are separate, but as a startup, those lines are blurred. And the board members often function as staff people too. But once you get to a position where you can pay people and you can set up staff positions, then you need to start clearly defining those lines, clearly defining those roles, so there is no gray area about what staff people do and about what board members do. I really hope that makes sense to y'all, because I know it can get complicated and it can feel frustrating, but I want to make sure you know the rules so you don't get caught up or you don't get hemmed up in a situation that you didn't mean to be in. So I promised to share some information about how to transition to paid staff. So I've done videos on this. I did a video on how to pay yourself a salary, so make sure you check this out. I'm going to be covering a little bit of the same information, but here's some tips that I'm going to give you right now. First things first, I want you to prepare and plan for staff. So do you even know that you want to transition to staff? Do you know how many staff you want? Do you know what roles they're going to fulfill, right? Have you written out job descriptions? Have you put together an organizational chart? Because if you don't plan for that, then you hiring people is going to be haphazard. It's going to be more like, oh, we're burnt out. We need somebody. Let's scrounge up the money to pay somebody to do this. And then you're going to bring on somebody who you're going to try to get to do everything. And that's the easiest way to get burnt out. And usually that's what happens with the executive director. They tend to get paid first, right? And then they have to do everything. And it gets really overwhelming. So even if you can't afford all of the staff positions that you need to carry out the goals for the year, still write it down and still clearly define those roles and have descriptions for those people. Why? Because you have to prepare for what you want to be, not for what you are now. You have to be vision-minded as a new nonprofit. So you need to put the steps in place. And if you don't have the vision in place, you don't put the necessary provision in place to get to that vision, right? So that leads me to my second point. You got to know how many staff you want, because you then have to budget for it. You have to build that into your budget so you can get your mind right and know that I need to raise money to cover these positions, right? So if you know you're going to hire for certain positions, then you know you're going to put money in the budget to make sure you can raise enough for their salary, to make sure you can raise enough for payroll, to make sure you can raise enough for workman's comp insurance, all those kinds of things, right? So you need to be prepared resource-wise in order to pay those people. And then the last point I want to make about that is that you need to have your paperwork in order, and you need to start thinking about how you're going to transition people. Make sure you have employee agreements in place. Make sure you have your insurance up to date in order for you to pay people. Make sure you have all your payroll and all that set up. Make sure you have an HR manual, an employee handbook that you can refer to, or make sure you're building to that so when you have staff, you have what you need in place. Make sure you have a standard operating procedures manual or something in place so that there are systems that staff, once they're hired, they know what's expected of them, they know how to do something, and it's a process that's laid out, that's clear, that anybody can follow in that position. So those are just some of the things that I just want to share with you if you want to prepare to pay staff, but make sure you check out my video on how to get paid as a founder, because it provides some tools and some tips as well. Now, you heard me say some things. You heard me say an employee handbook. You heard me talk about a manual. You heard me talk about workman's comp insurance when it comes to paying people. And if that sounds foreign to you, or if you're like, oh, I didn't know that that was a thing, make sure you check out my nonprofit startup workbook. So that is a workbook that walks you through your first year. It gives you a roadmap, and it has a bunch of different worksheets that covers different areas. One of the areas that it covers is insurance, and another area that it covers is staffing. So it walks you through the basic things you need to prepare for staff. So I want to make sure you check out that workbook so you have all the resources that you need. I've been getting great feedback on the workbook, and people love going through it. They think it's a great resource. So make sure you check that out below. So y'all, thank you so much for watching. If you need assistance from me, make sure you visit me at www.bossonabudget.com, and I will see you in the next video.